We affirm, on balance, diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power. Our framework in this round is we should prioritize peace over everything else because it's a precedent for lives and economy. With that said, let's jump into our first contention, which is increasing threat, and the way we handle conflict. Our subpoint A is weapons and the cost of war. Humanity as a whole has been increasingly a threat to itself over the past few centuries. Before World War II and even World War I, wars were made using relatively small weapons. But as we develop technologically, we can see that we're creating more and more dangerous weapons. Before World War II and World War I, we can see that swords and bows only killed 1 to 2 people, but now nuclear weapons can create huge destruction. Let's give you the example of Hiroshima, in which it was the first nuclear bomb that was detonated. Over 800,000 lives were lost and 700,000 were injured. Also, the radiation of the nuclear bomb was long-term because it lingered in the air for many years to come. Since then, we've increased the threat of the way we increase of nuclear weapons. This is crucial because in order to solve the problem of increasing the threat we pose to ourselves, we have to vote for us. But then, From all the impacts of risk of nuclear extinction we have today, we are left unanimously to agree that the impacts of war are too high to risk. This, therefore, deems military power as an inadequate way to preserve peace, as which it causes these impacts to happen in the first place. Diplomacy provides solvency and much more than military power because it can prevent conflicts from occurring in the first place. Subpoint B is adapting to the modern world. The world has transformed rapidly in the decades since the end of the Cold War. An old system is gone, and although easy to identify what has changed, it is not clear what the new system to take its place is. Old patterns have come unstuck, and new patterns are emerging. It is too soon to define them clearly. The list of potential epoch-making changes is familiar by now. The end of era of bipolarity and a new wave of democratization, increasing globalization of information and economic power, more frequent efforts at international coordination of security policies. The Western world, especially America, has been waging war to achieve peace for a decade and a half. Public discussion in the United States rings with call for an end of war making and revival of diplomatic efforts to achieve global aims. Peace through diplomacy has become a national catchphrase. Many public figures increasingly play down the need for force or military action, deeming the United States foreign policy be reconstructed around rhetoric, conversation, diplomacy. Diplomacy is only viable solution in this world. See our policy and military failures in Vietnam. Contention 2, diplomacy solves. Furthering national interest through peaceful means is the ultimate purpose of diplomacy. International relations expert Hans Mortagu wrote, of all the factors that make for the power of a nation, the most important, however unstable, is the quality of diplomacy. High-quality diplomacy is one of the strongest weapons a country can possess in their arsenal. Weak diplomacy, on the other hand, can thrust a nation into crisis. According to Joseph Nye, public diplomacy is an important tool in the arsenal of smart power, but public diplomacy requires an understanding of the role of credibility, self-criticism, and civil society in generating soft power. According to Sending 2017, diplomacy is less about dialogue than it is about getting things done. Even if, Judge, you don't buy this, know the consequences of diplomacy failing are far smaller than the military power failing, because military power failing can cause war and mutual destruction. Contention 3, military power aggravates conflict. Subpoint A, arms race. Military power leads to a global arms race. The rise of military power leads to countries always attempting to get the upper hand. An arms race in its original usage is a competition between 2 or more parties or groups to have the best armed forces. For those reasons, Judge, I strongly urge a pro ballot. Question?
Yes. Okay, yeah, I don't need anything. So,
Hold on. Second. Are you second con speaker?
oh, my bad.
Oh, what do you need? All right.
Do you need part-time?
No, unless you can tell me anything.
Ready when you're
No. Okay. Can we take like 10 seconds of part-time,
Sure.
please? Okay, so I want to say like diplomacy, ask them like diplomacy doesn't need to be negotiated, you have to be yes. And then what you have to say is then diplomacy has to be bad.
Okay. All right. We're
Or
done.
it's not effective. Why would they go to negotiating?
All right. So
13.
you, sorry.
Okay, hold on. Okay, ready when you are.
Judge ready?
Yes.
Partner ready?
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
Candidates ready?
Yeah.
All right. My time starts now. Your second contention was about waging war to achieve peace through diplomacy and about high quality diplomacy. And can you
Wait.
Okay, can you provide
Okay.
at least 5 examples about how war causes failure?
5 examples.
About how failed war. I mean, there have been many wars, so 5 is not a
Okay,
big
well,
number.
first of all, our contention 2 is diplomacy solves. And
yeah, how about how failed wars cause more wars?
Wait, what do you mean? Wait, where do we talk about this?
In your second contention, you mentioned about how like the impact of failed treaties is way less than the impact of failed wars. So can you?
Okay.
give
So
any
I think
examples of failed
you're
wars?
misunderstanding what we read. So what we tell you at the end.
My question is, can you provide examples of failed wars?
Okay. Well, first, can I clear something up and then answer your question? Because I think you misunderstand our second contention. So at the end of our second contention, we tell you that the consequences of diplomacy failing are far less than military power failing. We tell you that when military power fails,
All right, thank you. I'll move on to my next question. So how can diplomacy occur if it's not backed up by military power?
Okay, so what we need to see here is if a country feels threatened, they're less likely to come to the table. Let's take North Korea for example. Right now,
North Korea has come to the table about 50 times, and they've in the past they've agreed to reduce the number of missiles they made.
so what are you saying?
So your example is wrong
What? I didn't even say my example, but okay.
about North Korea.
Okay, you want to ask a question again?
Yeah. So how? You said something about the arms race. Could you explain your third?
Okay, so arms race is basically when we see that there are more military, when we have an increase in military power, or we see that there are going to be more arms in the region. What we see here is that when there's more arms in the region, there's going to be an arms race because everyone's just trying to get the upper hand on another person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
My time starts now. Diplomacy is the art of saying, nice doggy, until you can find a rock. Because we agree with Will Rogers, we firmly negate the resolution that, on balance, diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power. First, because diplomacy is not effective unless backed by military power. Second, military deterrence is the simplest and most effective way to prevent conflict. And third, military power resolves conflict. Contention 1. Diplomacy is not effective unless backed by military power. Diplomacy has come from the use of military power. We define military power as the potential resources that a nation can mobilize against other nations for purposes of military deterrence, defense, and war. According to CNN, the sole reason diplomacy occurs is because of the threat of hard power. Without this hard power, no one would seek to compromise. For example, North Korea would not even come to the negotiating table if it wasn't for the threat of immediate military retaliation. Then again, when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, Kuwait tried many times to negotiate with him, but without real military force powerful enough to back their demands, Saddam Hussein still found it easier to attack Kuwait. This meant that the people of Kuwait suffered because diplomacy was not effective. Contention 2. Military deterrence is the biggest and most effective way to prevent conflict. Clearly, the best way to ensure peace is to make sure there are no conflicts at all. Only our military power has kept North Korea from attacking us. They've clearly proven to us that diplomacy is not the answer to the solution, including withdrawing from the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty and ignoring the UN sanctions. The reason we are at peace with them in the first place is because of the Korean War. During the Cold War, neither the US nor Russia dared attack each other because of the other's military power. Kuwait also could have avoided conflict had it been part of a strong military alliance. Instead, Saddam Hussein saw an easy and weak country to attack filled with oil-rich resources. These countries realized that provoking further conflict would be risky. Instead of keeping quiet because of each other's military might, that is military deterrence. The very reason the Soviet was afraid to attack us, the reason we are still here today. Contention 3. Military power resolves conflict. According to the National Review, they are the age-old tools of advising the more bellicose parties to calm down and get a grip. During the World War, despite multiple attempts of diplomacy through appeasement, Hitler refused to be satisfied. Instead, it took 50 million deaths from the Allied powers to remind the appeased Axis that they were all along far weaker than the Allied powers. After the World Trade Center attack, diplomacy meant compromising our nation's safety and pride to people who are willing to kill themselves to kill us. We clearly can't take a humble stance like that after American blood has been shed. During the Civil War, people tried diplomacy on both sides. However, both sides kept wanting more. This is why they use military conflict to address this conflict, and right now, the North and the South have become unified again. And because that is why military power is the most effective. So because diplomacy is not effective unless backed by military power, military deterrence is the simplest and most effective way to make sure there are no conflicts. And finally, military power resolves conflict. Judge, I urge you to vote a con ballot. Thank you.
Ready for crossfire?
Yeah.
All right. So, anybody not ready? All right. So, let's begin with your first contention, where you basically tell us that military power is needed for diplomacy, right?
My first contention said diplomacy is not effective unless backed by military power.
Okay. So,
yeah.
okay. So basically, you think that when military power and diplomacy work together, they produce results, correct?
No, I'm saying diplomacy is not effective at all unless backed by military power. Without this military power, nobody would even come to the negotiating table.
Okay. So, you give us this example of Saddam Hussein, right?
Yes, correct.
And how he attacked Kuwait, right?
Yeah, correct.
So, can you tell me how diplomacy failed in that scenario?
Well, as I've told you in my first contention, Kuwait tried many times to negotiate with Saddam Hussein. However, they didn't have the necessary military force to back themselves up. So what Saddam Hussein still found it easier to use military force to get what he wanted instead of agreeing to Kuwait's demands.
So can you tell me how he invaded that place?
So how he invaded Kuwait?
Yeah.
What would you like to know about his invasion of Kuwait?
Actually, no, never mind.
Okay.
So your second contention goes on deterrence, basically,
Yes.
right? So you say that military power is a necessary deterrent.
Really?
Is a deterrent.
Yes, it's a deterrent, yes.
Okay, so you give this example of North Korea, right?
Yes.
And so what is the deterrent in that picture?
The deterrence is that both sides, the U.S., which is a major world power, and North Korea, they both have nuclear weapons, so they don't want to attack each other, and through military deterrence, North Korea is afraid to attack us because of the force we can unleash against them if they attack us.
Okay. So
That's
then,
how it maintains peace, yeah.
What?
I said that's how it maintains peace.
Oh, okay. And then what your third contention was how it resolves conflict, correct?
Correct.
So are you talking about only military power or military power and diplomacy?
I'm talking about military power.
You're only talking about military power in your third contention.
Let me check my case before I make sure. Yes, military power was the one that resolved the conflict.
Okay. So you gave us this example of the Civil War, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, never mind, that's time.
Okay.
Partner ready?
Yep.
Opponents ready?
Hold on. Okay.
Judge ready? Alright. Sorry. And my time starts now. Okay, Judge. My opponent's first contention was that peace is greater than everything and the cost of war is more dangerous because of weapons and people dying. However, military power is the only way to solve certain problems and things that diplomacy can't do, like terrorism, for example. On average, 216,915 people have died because of terror attacks all over the world. And the only way to solve this is through military power. According to Homeland Security, it's the major way on how they fight terrorists. And in addition, 3,000 Americans have died because of terror attacks. So the only way to fight terror attacks is because of military power. And this outweighs their claim of saying that, war causes the breach of peace and how it kills people. In addition, they also stated that war affects people after the war, with other symptoms and stuff. However, there are peace programs to help avoid this. According to the UN, in many war-torn countries, peace programs are implemented to save these people from war and from their recollections of war. So this actually helps create more peace after a war, which counters their second contention. In addition, they said that a failed treaty would have way less of an impact than a failed war. However, this is incorrect because many failed treaties lead to a prolongation of war. For example, the Treaty of Versailles led to World War II, and the Treaty of Laramie led to another war between the Sioux and the U.S. In addition, the Gulf War was extended because of the failed treaty, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact renounced war as an instrument of national policy, so U.S. basically banned war, but then they fought in another war 2 years later. So this this is basically saying that failed diplomacy can actually extend wars. In addition, according to the United Nations Refugee Health Center, over one half of treaties after wars have failed, and they've actually extended war, and in another 10 years, war broke out again. So this is showing that treaties have actually failed to prevent wars, and diplomacy has failed overall. In addition, in our first contention, we've proved that without military power, diplomacy would have no effect on anything, and it wouldn't be backed up. And for the third contention, I'd like to offer the rebuttal that there is deterrence in the arms race. So after the arms race between the U.S. and Russia in the Cold War, there was basically no war between U.S. and Russia. There were maybe a couple of small conflicts, but it's majorly settled because if one country nukes the other, it's basically suicide. And for these reasons, I urge a con ballot. Thank you very much.
Good job.
I think I copied it. So.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Is it her cross?
Oh, it's cross.
Attacking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alright. Is anybody not ready? Alright, time starts now. So you talk about treaties. Where in our case do we talk about treaties?
Oh, in your second contention, you said that a failed treaty is way, way, way worse than, is way, way better than a failed war. So I just want to
No,
comment
we're
on that.
saying that failed diplomacy is way better.
Yeah,
than
a failed
full-out
diplomacy.
war. Essentially, what happens is that in your world, you're advocating for more weapons on both sides to defend each other, and if that breaks out into a full-out war, you add the nukes of everyone.
But it
all
won't
the
break
places
out
in the
into a
world.
full-out war because of deterrence. In fact,
So you're saying that just having the weapons is going to have a deterrent
Yeah.
against breaking into war?
this is why North Korea and the U.S. are in war, and that's why after
and
the
we
Cold
see the
War, there
only-
weren't many other wars between the U.S. and Russia, because if there was a major war between U.S. and Russia, both countries would essentially suicide.
All right.
So it creates a deterrence effect.
How was the Cold War resolved?
The Cold War was resolved through deterrence.
Through diplomacy. Look at the Cuban
The
Missile
Cold War
Crisis.
wasn't-
We were able to
Cold
resolve that
War-
entire conflict.
Okay, but
with
the only
diplomacy.
reason that it was resolved through diplomacy is because both countries had hard power to back it up, to back their demands up.
Wait, so
For
you're
example,
advocating for war to be able to solve for these problems?
no, I'm advocating for deterrence because
Alright, so you're not taking
both
into
countries
account
have.
of what if something goes wrong in your world versus what goes wrong in our world. Am I correct?
What's your question?
So you're not taking into account of the aftermath of failure.
But they won't fail because of deterrence, because both
So
countries
you're
will
saying
suicide.
that you having lots
Time
of
and
weapons.
time and time again in history, deterrence has actually solved and maintained peace. Take the Cold War, take now with U.S. and North Korea. We haven't broken into war, even though both of us have nuclear weapons, only because it would be
Alright,
essentially
wait,
suicide for both countries.
With North Korea, we
History.
see North Korea threatening more and more as we threaten them more and more. I don't see that as a solution whatsoever.
Yeah, but because of deterrence, North Korea hasn't. Okay, sorry.
Anybody not ready?
Wait. Yep.
Alright, time starts now. Let's start on the contention one, which talks about how diplomacy is not effective unless used with military power. First, we see one gigantic flaw in their argument. They're conceding that diplomacy is the only way to solve conflicts in this debate. This is crucial because essentially they're defaulting to our side, even though they're saying it's accessing through their side. But then we have a response to that. So first they talk about how military power is being used to link into diplomacy, but what you see is that when you use military power, you actually push people away from the negotiations table. Look at the U.S. and North Korea. So when U.S. in the past have been talked diplomatically with North Korea, we were able to substantially curb their nuclear development. But what happened when we started threatening with nuclear weapons, they just started proliferating and ignoring all the UN sanctions as they said in Crossfire. So essentially what you see is that with military power, you're actually aggravating people more to link into an arms race and basically have the chance of war go up and their lives being lost. And we're advocating for the saving of lives in today's debate. Now we move on to contention 2, which is about how military power acts as a deterrent. So having one side of a conflict with more weapons than the other causes the other side to add more weapons to their own arsenal. That is essentially what is called an arms race, because one side will not be feeling secure enough to be able to talk to the other side unless they have more weapons. So what happens in their world is that they build up a nuclear arsenal of arms race. And with an arms race, Ryan quantifies that there will be a 331 chance of war, and Powell quantifies that even a war in North Korea, for example, would cause 1 million dead and $1 trillion of economic damage. This is huge because miscalculation goes up so high that the chance of war that we even talk about in contention 1 about how weapons are so dangerous these days that we need to go away from using military power. So essentially, in their world, they're advocating for war to solve problems and make peace. Then in contention 3 talks about how military power solves because of mutually assured destruction. They talk about how because one side has weapons, the other side won't decide to attack because they have weapons to destroy the other side. But this links into more tensions and more essentially miscalculation and uncertainty on different problems. You push people away from the negotiations table, you push people away from being able to talk to each other, so you won't gain any solvency out of this. Today, Judge, if you're going to vote for solvency, you're going to be voting for our side. Then let's clear one thing up that came up in Crossfire. So my opponents say that due to diplomacy, there has been failing treaties every time after a war has ended. So they talk about the Treaty of Sadai, which about Germany leading into World War II. But essentially, that treaty was one example, and what's more is that it was very unfair to Germany, and that's why they complain. What's more is that we can give you 3 more treaties: the Moscow Treaty, the U.S.-South Korean Free Trade Agreement, and Arms Race Treaty that go against their entire logic. And thus, you vote pro.
Opponents ready?
Yep.
Teammate ready? Judge ready? Okay. Cool. Okay. So let's start now. So let's jump into this terrorism point. They basically tell you their response to our peace framework is that terrorism is there. But I would argue that terrorism is caused by military power. Once we see that more arms are being laid around, we can see that terrorism actually just goes up. But even if you don't buy that argument, you can see that with diplomacy, we're actually going to dictatorships and we're going to be peaceful. We're not going to bring arms and go and raid their house or houses because what we want to do is we want to solve this problem once and for all. But then with that said, let's go into their response about our treaties argument. First, James tells you that they misunderstand our thing. What we tell you is that we're telling that the consequences of failing diplomacy is far better than the consequences of military power. What we tell you is that the consequences of failed military power, is war and mutual destruction. We tell you that there's no if I go and talk to someone about how I feel, they're not going to get as mad as me if I go up to them and slap them or something. The consequences are a lot less under our world. They totally misunderstand this, and they give you 16 evidences that basically talks about treaties. Nowhere in our case we talk about treaties. But even if we give you 3 treaties that actually have been successful. First, the Moscow Treaty, which talks about the limited nuclear arsenal between Moscow and the United States. Second is the United States-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, and third is Arms Race Treaty. Then, let's go to our third contention, which they basically tell you arms race. The only response to this is deterrence. As James tells you in rebuttal, that the deterrence only works if you see any solvency. Right now in North Korea, as they keep on trying to bring up, the United States is not acting as a deterrent. Instead, it's making the situation even worse. Look to IDSP, International Security Development Program, who finds that North Korea has actually only increased their nuclear arsenal for the times that the United States is in the region. This is crucial because if they're trying to argue something about deterrence, they can't, because what we can see is that it just aggravates the area. For all those reasons, Judge, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
My time starts now. So in this defense speech, I'd like to go over my contentions and why they still stand. So in contention, so basically what our opponents have done is they've presented a solution that means compromising our nation's safety by decreasing the amount of arms we have. And I'd like to point out first that that diplomacy doesn't even work. For example, take the Sunshine Policy. It estimated that only, according to Stanford, the U.S. gave over $500 million to North Korea to expand their arsenal. This is through diplomacy. This is the reason why we are facing the North Korean missile crisis today. Yet, the only thing that's solving this issue is the military power. And military power has clearly proven that diplomacy isn't working. Next, I'd like to point out the issue of terrorism. In terrorism, we can't negotiate with ISIS because those are people who are willing to kill themselves to kill us. We can't negotiate with them because there is no one to negotiate with. They're willing to kill a bunch of people, and we cannot compromise our nation's safety and the American blood lost in those terrorist attacks. Next, I'd like to point out that during the Cold War, we've successfully used military deterrence, as you could see in the North Korean missile crisis, which, by the way, I'd like to point out once more, was the cause of diplomacy. During the Cold War, we used military deterrence because both sides had nuclear weapons, so such that both sides were afraid to attack each other. And this is why we have maintained peace. And now that the Cold War is over, we can see clearly that military conflict has prevented all of this. Next, they said terrorism is the only way to fight terrorism is through military power. Again, I like to stress, and not through diplomacy. So for our third contention, it says we've said military power resolves conflict. They haven't responded to this. We said during World War, despite multiple attempts of diplomacy through appeasements, Hitler refused to be satisfied. They still haven't refuted this example through World War II, and this is the result of. This is the result, yeah. So they haven't refuted that, and diplomacy failed and through appeasement. Thank you. God damn, it's horrible.
I'll just be extending the main points in this debate and talking about why we won this debate. Alright. Is anybody not ready?
No.
Alright, time starts now. Today, Judge, will be voting off of the main issue of lives. So let's first talk about the terrorism point. My opponents keep saying that terrorism is a main problem that you can't solve with diplomacy. What we see is that terrorism is only caused by military power. Having military power and using military power puts more weapons into the equation of war, which means that there are more weapons lying around for terrorists to pick up and use. Essentially, they're the causation of the problem. They're saying they can show solvency for that problem, so it doesn't even exist in our world. Now let's move on to our own contentions, where we talk about the cost of war and how using military power can have drastic effects compared to using diplomacy. Essentially, what we tell you is that using diplomacy, even if it fails, has less drastic outcomes than using military power. Military power leads to an entire full-out war, when with diplomacy, you can just have a few failed treaties. Even though the failed treaties, they talk about, like, they give one example about a failed treaty, but that treaty was unfavorable to Germany, and that's why they led to a war. So we refute them right there. What's more is that we talk about how the cost of war and how weapons have evolved from bows and arrows to now to nuclear weapons. So essentially, you're going to be going for the safer side today and saving more lives that can be lost through using military power and increasing the chance of war. Where we extend our two cards, which is Ryder in 2011, tells you that there's a 331% chance of war with more arms in the equation of war, and also 1 million people dying and $1 trillion of economic damage that can occur. Then we talk about how having diplomacy actually solves problems. So we see, let's take the example that they give us about North Korea. So the U.S. using diplomatic efforts has been able to substantially curb North Korea's pursuit of making a nuclear weapon. But it is only when we turn to making threats and using military power, essentially, that we see North Korea proliferating and adding more weapons in the equation of war. And thus, we affirm.
Alright, partner ready? Yep. Opponents ready? Judge ready? Alright, and my time starts now. Judge, the major factor in this debate today is lives, and lives is the reason why you should vote for us. Terrorism kills over 217,000 people worldwide in only 10 years. And the only way to fight terrorism is because of military power. This is a problem we need to fix. We need to stop letting our people die. We need to stop letting families just be killed because some terrorist organization thinks it's apt to do so. Right? We need to stop this. And the only way we can fix this is military power. And contrary to my opponent's beliefs, it does exist in the real world. And weapons aren't just lying around, and terrorism is not caused by military power. In fact, I have no proof of this. So this is why we need to fix this problem by using military power. And it's the only solution to do so. In addition, a major point in this debate was arms race. And we win this debate because we've provided historical examples of which the arms race has actually led to peace because of deterrence. Because we both have nuclear weapons as opposed to bows and arrows, we've maintained peace because if we nuked each other, it would essentially be suicide for both countries. So both countries do not nuke each other. And we've provided historical examples instead of a futuristic hypothetical study because we have concrete evidence that has happened in the past. In addition, I would like to state many treaties that failed and that extended wars and that killed more people. The Gulf War, the Treaty of Laramie, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the Treaty of Versailles, all extended wars, and they've killed so many more people than war had. In addition, if diplomacy fails, then you can have hard power as a safety net. And in fact, hard power backs up diplomacy. I'd like to go back to our lives contention. Our opponents made the framework that whoever saves the most lives and maintains the most peace wins. And we've proved that we save more lives by countering terrorism using hard power, and we've also had more long-lasting peace because diplomacy does not often work. And for these reasons, I urge a con ballot. Yeah.
Nice job. Yeah. Good job.
You guys did it good.